Nolan's Odyssey looks wrong. The ships look like Viking longships imported from the wrong millennium. The armor looks like Batman wore a toga. The palette is dark gray, where the source material called for the wine-dark sea and gleaming bronze. Robert Pattinson says, "Daddy." Matt Damon screams, "Let's go!" with the cadence of a man storming a beach at Normandy. Everyone is arguing about whether these choices are good or bad. The argument is being framed wrong, though. The question worth asking is simpler and more uncomfortable. What's the mechanism producing every one of these choices? Because once you see it, you realize, this is a director running a machine that's worked for 20 years, finally colliding with source material old enough and sacred enough to make the output look bizarre. Let's set the stage with what people are actually upset about, because the specifics matter. First, we have the ships. Nolan's fleet triggered immediate Viking comparisons across every forum. The all-black hulls, the lack of traditional Greek cutwater. The historical Mycenaean galleys were themselves narrow, dark vessels, single-decked, often pitch black with red painted at the prow. The popular image of vivid, colorful Greek ships traces partly to Homer's poetic descriptions and partly to centuries of artistic interpretation. The trailer ships occupy a strange position, visually closer to the archaeological record than to the picture most viewers carry in their heads, and still distant enough from that mental picture to register as Norse. Next, we have the armor. Agamemnon's chestplate triggered immediate comparisons to Batman across every forum. Black, sculpted, quasi-tactical, closer to Wayne Enterprises than to the boar tusk helmets and bronze pectorals associated with late Bronze Age Mycenaean warriors, than to the boar tusk helmets and bronze pectorals associated with the late Bronze Age Mycenaean warriors. Other soldiers appear in generic, blackened leather. Reporting surfaced that during pre-production, Nolan's team emailed Dimitrios Kassikis of Hellenic Armors, a Greek blacksmith specializing in Bronze Age military reconstruction. According to him, the team sent a single inquiry and then went silent. The relationship consisted of one message. The production moved forward independently. The question worth asking, what made that follow-up unnecessary? And then we have the palette. Mycenaean and Homeric tradition presents a world saturated with color, polished bronze that gleamed like gold. Nolan's trailer borders on almost monochrome. Slate gray skies, unpainted stone, skin tones drained of Mediterranean warmth. And then we have the accents. Everyone speaks past the received pronunciation that historical epics have conditioned us to expect, past the Peter O'Toole cadence, past the Olivier gravity. Everyone sounds American. Everyone sounds current. In an interview with Empire magazine, Nolan himself confirmed that he was working with Emily Wilson's 2017 translation, which deliberately used accessible, contemporary English. The contemporary diction is a deliberate translation choice. The weakness of this translation forms only one aspect of the story here, though. It also serves as a poor underlying structure for everything else. Good writing, of course, remains the most important part of what makes a film work. Each of these choices, taken alone, could be a mistake. But together, they form a pattern. And the pattern points to something specific. A method of engaging with source material that Nolan has used his entire career. A method that, until now, has run smoothly past anything this old or this culturally loaded. The mechanism, how Nolan mines source material. Here's the thing about Christopher Nolan. Across his entire career, every adaptation has been an interpretation. This observation about his working method is the key to understanding why his Odyssey looks the way it does. You see, Nolan mines source material. He takes a known property and identifies the structural core, the tension, the paradox, the psychological engine, and discards everything outside of it. The surface details, the expected tone, the familiar iconography. All of it is expendable when it gets between the audience and the story or the architecture he wants to expose. Batman Begins is a film about how fear becomes a weapon, and Bruce Wayne happens to be the case study. The Dark Knight is a film about whether a society's moral architecture can survive an assault on its foundational lie. That order is stronger than chaos. Inception is a film about whether a man can build an elaborate mental palace to avoid standing in the rubble of his own actual life. Oppenheimer is a film about whether a mind brilliant enough to split the atom is also brilliant enough to live with what it's done. In every case, the mechanism is the same. Strip the surface, preserve the core, rebuild around Nolan's thesis. The result has been films that feel simultaneously familiar and alien, recognizably derived from their source material, and structurally transformed into something that serves a different master than the original. This method has worked for 20 years because Nolan has primarily applied it to the modern source material, comic books, original screenplays, recent history. The surface he strips away is contemporary enough that the audience read the stripping as sophistication. Dark and gritty Batman reads as an artistic choice, registers as a legitimate creative reinterpretation, because Batman has existed for nearly 9 decades and been reinterpreted dozens of times. There's no single, correct version to violate. The Odyssey, though, occupies a very different ground. The collision, why it looks wrong now. The Odyssey is one of the oldest stories in Western canon. It carries a 2,700-year-old poem with deep cultural gravity, well past the territory of a comic book with 80-plus years of competing interpretations. For most people, there's a vague but powerful sense of what it should look like. The wine-dark sea, sun-bleached stone, bronze armor gleaming, heroes speaking with gravity and formality. Perhaps for some, it's the Peter Jackson Tolkien visual grammar transposed onto Greece. When Nolan runs his mechanism on this material, what comes of it reads as wrong. The reading lands that way because the surface he's stripping away, the imagined historical Greek aesthetic, carries cultural weight in a way that Batman's yellow oval symbol never did. The mechanism keeps working. The cultural weight of what it strips away is what changes. Let's walk through the choices again, this time through the lens of the mechanism. The Viking ships. Nolan's method identifies the structural core of Odysseus' journey, a war machine coming home. Everything else is subordinate. So the visual language he reaches for is the language of imperial conquest, ships that carry armies across hostile open water. He had access to the historical record. He had the option of consulting Bronze Age experts, but he chose a different visual logic because the mechanism prioritizes structural truth over surface accuracy. The structural truth of the story for Nolan is war, so the ships look like war. And then we have the Batman-esque armor. Historical Mycenaean panoply is communal, designed for formation fighting, visible and proud. Nolan's mechanism identifies the structural core of Agamemnon as a man who rules through fear and concealment, so the armor becomes tactical, isolating, and black. It's the same visual language logic he applied to Bruce Wayne 15 years ago, as the mechanism reads both characters through the same lens, power that operates through shadow. You can disagree with the reading. In some senses I do as well. The choice, though, is the mechanism producing consistent output. And then we have the gray palette. What Nolan sees in the Odyssey is the structure of a man who has seen so much violence that the world has drained of color behind his eyes. Sitting beneath Homer's sensory richness, the aforementioned wine-dark sea, and the rosy-fingered dawn. Nolan is filtering Mycenaean Greece through the same desaturated grammar he uses for Dunkirk. The choice tracks, because a man who's been at war for a decade sees the world the way Dunkirk looks. Wilson's 2017 Odyssey is deliberately, aggressively accessible. She replaces the archaic formality of previous translations with plain, contemporary English where the original Greek allows it, using diction like daddy in scenes where young children address their fathers. It was a controversial choice among classicists, and it was praised by others for the exact same reason. It removes the museum glass between modern readers and ancient text. Nolan recognized in Wilson's approach a parallel to his own systems. He's doing to the visual and auditory surface what Wilson did to the linguistic surface, stripping the accumulated formality to make the structural core legible to the contemporary audience. And then we have the abandoned inquiry. Hellenic armor specializes in surface accuracy, getting the bronze right, getting the helmet shape right, getting the ship dimensions right. That expertise is valuable, but for productions prioritizing fidelity to the historical record. The conversation likely stopped at a single email because the mechanism and the artisan were oriented towards incompatible goals. What Homer actually gives Nolan, and what he takes. And now we return to the text, because understanding what Nolan is mining requires understanding what's actually there to extract. Homer's Odyssey operates as something beyond a travelogue, beyond an adventure story, beyond a highlight reel of monsters and temptations. These are the elements that survive in popular culture. Beneath them sits the core. A man who is so extraordinary at being extraordinary that he forgot how to be ordinary. A warrior can win any war, with the war inside his own house holding out against him. A man who is terrified of what he will find when he gets home, and worse, of who he will be when there are no more wars to define him. That's what Nolan's system identifies and preserves. To Nolan, the sensory richness, the mythological creatures, the Mediterranean light, they all sit at the level of surface. Beautiful, ancient, culturally sacred surface, but still surface. Consider the departure. Greek mythology around Homer's poem gives us the story of Odysseus trying to stay home from Troy. He feigned madness. He had a newborn son. He had a wife who understood him. A kingdom at peace. They placed the infant Telemachus in front of the plow, and his sanity broke through the performance. He stopped the blade and proved that he was sane. He sealed his own fate. This story comes from the broader mythological tradition surrounding Homer's poem, and it tells us something the poem assumes we already know. Odysseus understood, from the start, that the war would take him from the life he actually wanted. And then consider the return. After 10 years of war, the other Greeks sail home. Odysseus takes the long way. He gets lost, he takes detours. Poseidon curses him, yes. Beneath the mythological layer, there's a psychological one that runs perhaps a little deeper. Odysseus is stalling. He is the patron saint of every person who works themselves to exhaustion and then, when the work stops, discovers that they have no idea how to sit still in their own house. And then consider the arrival. He lands on Ithaca and disguises himself as a beggar. He hides in his own home. He sits beside his weeping wife in the guise of a stranger and tells her elaborate false stories, grieving with her for a husband he keeps locked away from her recognition. He treats his marriage as a tactical operation. When he finally reveals himself, it is through violence. He slaughters the suitors, turning his dining hall into a battlefield. He brings the war home because the war is the only language he still speaks. And that, I think, is the structure Nolan is mining. It's the same structure he's mined for every protagonist he's ever written. Cobb diving into dreams because his guilt has nowhere else to live. Oppenheimer building a bomb, perhaps because he believes his intellect can control the uncontrollable. Different source materials, but the same structural core, the same mechanism. The uncomfortable implication. So here's where the diagnosis leads, and the conclusion lands in uncomfortable territory. Nolan's mechanism that produced The Dark Knight and Inception and Oppenheimer is the same mechanism producing the Viking ships and the Batman armor and the gray palette and the American accents. The output looks bizarre this time because the mechanism is functioning normally, and the input, a 2,700-year-old Greek poem, is so culturally loaded that any departure from its expected surface reads as a violation, well past the threshold of reinterpretation. This means something specific about the film we're likely going to get in July. It will probably work as a Christopher Nolan film. Tight structural logic, escalating tension, a protagonist defined by a single psychological contradiction that drives every choice he makes. As a Homeric adaptation, though, in the sense of a film that preserves the sensory and tonal qualities that make the Odyssey feel like the Odyssey, it will definitely struggle. Whether it will be good or bad is a question the film will have to answer on its own. The system itself, the thing producing every choice people are arguing about right now, is traceable, it's consistent, and it's been running in plain sight for 20 years. If you're drawn to stories that challenge and inspire, subscribe and be part of the conversation. I'll be watching closely as we get closer to July, and I'll probably have more to say once the film actually exists. For now, thanks for watching, and stay copacetic.